Chapter 4. Freeze. The nervous system's still point, braced, silent, watchful, and far more active than it appears. Definition. Freeze is perhaps the most widely misunderstood of all the F responses, because from the outside it looks passive, still, quiet, apparently uninvolved, while from the inside it is often anything but. The freeze response is what happens when the nervous system assesses that neither fighting nor fleeing is a viable option in the face of threat. Rather than remaining in the impossible position of wanting to act and being unable to, the system selects a third strategy: complete stillness. This is not passivity. It is an active, energy-intensive state in which the body is simultaneously flooded with stress chemistry and held rigidly immobile by inhibitory neurological processes. It is the paradox of being fully mobilized and completely unable to move. It is essential to distinguish freeze from rest, from relaxation, and from peace. A person resting is in a low activation state. Their muscles are softened, their breathing is slow and deep, their mind is quiet. A person in freeze may look superficially similar from the outside, but is physiologically in an entirely different place. Internally, the freeze state is often experienced as a kind of locked high alert, the sense of holding one's breath, of being braced, of extreme vigilance under a surface of apparent stillness. The deer in headlights is not relaxed. It is stopped. There are two neurologically distinct types of freeze, and it is important to keep them separate because they have different underlying mechanisms, different internal experiences, and different recovery pathways. Sympathetic freeze, sometimes called the active freeze or high alert freeze, is driven by the sympathetic nervous system at maximum activation, held in check by simultaneous inhibitory signals. This is the braced, watchful, locked still quality of the deer in headlights. The body is fully ready to run or fight, but it cannot initiate either action. The second type, dorsal freeze or shutdown freeze, is a low activation, parasympathetic collapse state and is what is described more fully in the FLOP chapter. This chapter focuses primarily on sympathetic freeze, with appropriate acknowledgement of the continuum between the two. Neurobiology. The neuroscience of freeze involves a structure that is not widely discussed in popular accounts of the stress response, the periaqueductal gray, or PAG. The PAG is a region surrounding the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain, and it is one of the brain's primary coordinators of defensive responses. It receives input from the amygdala and projects responses to the body, and it is particularly implicated in the selection of the freeze response when threat is perceived as imminent and inescapable. The PAG essentially issues the immobility command, and the body complies, regardless of what the conscious mind would prefer. The paradox of the sympathetic freeze state is neurologically remarkable. The sympathetic nervous system is fully activated, all the same adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol flooding the system as in fight or flight, but the motor output is simultaneously inhibited. The body is an engine running at full throttle with the brakes on. This paradox is maintained by the simultaneous action of excitatory and inhibitory neurochemicals, specifically, the GABAergic or GABA releasing inhibitory interneurons that suppress motor output while the sympathetic system continues to fire. The result is a physiological state of extraordinary tension beneath a surface of apparent stillness. Sensory changes during freeze are dramatic and important. Hearing sharpens substantially. The person in freeze can often hear with extraordinary clarity, attending to every sound in the environment for information about whether the threat has passed. Vision narrows, paradoxically sometimes producing a tunneled clarity on the threatening stimulus. Peripheral sensation may dim, and time, perhaps most strikingly, seems to slow. This time distortion is real. It reflects the slowing of temporal processing under extreme stress, as the brain's threat-focused resources create a high-fidelity but slow-motion processing of the environment. Chemistry. The chemistry of sympathetic freeze is a study in biological paradox. The primary stress hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, are all elevated, as they are in fight and flight. But simultaneously, the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is acting on the motor system, preventing the discharge of the mobilization energy. The person is chemically ready to run or fight, but neurologically unable to do either. This combination produces the characteristic internal experience of freeze, the feeling of being locked, suspended, caught, trapped. Endorphins, the brain's own opioid-like molecules, are released in significant quantities during freeze. They serve the evolutionary purpose of pain suppression. A prey animal that freezes and is caught must be able to survive the experience of being held without the pain response triggering a struggle that would accelerate its death. In humans, the endorphin release during freeze contributes to the slightly dissociated, distant quality that many people report, a sense of observing what is happening from slightly outside one's own body. This dissociative quality is protective. It reduces the subjective experience of the threat. Recovery from freeze chemistry involves the gradual clearing of inhibitory signals, the discharge of the sympathetic activation energy, and the re-engagement of the parasympathetic system. This recovery is often visible as trembling, shaking, deep involuntary sighing, and a surge of emotion, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughter, as the body completes the interrupted response cycle. These are healthy, adaptive completion processes, and they should be recognized as such rather than suppressed. Brain waves. The brainwave pattern during freeze is a mixed and somewhat unusual state. The high-frequency beta activity of threat processing, the fast, fragmented, narrowed thinking of the activated stress response, is present, driven by the ongoing sympathetic activation and amygdala firing. But simultaneously, the inhibition of motor output and the dissociative endorphin response produce a layer of slower frequency activity, creating a distinctive mixed state in which the brain is simultaneously running fast and being held still. This mixed brainwave state produces the characteristic cognitive experience of freeze, thoughts that move rapidly, sometimes panic fast, but go nowhere. The person in freeze often describes their mind as both racing and completely blank, which seems contradictory but is neurologically accurate. The fast thinking is threat processing. The blankness is the inability to formulate a plan or initiate action, because the part of the brain responsible for selecting and initiating intentional behavior is effectively suspended. People in freeze frequently report being unable to find words, unable to think clearly about what to do next, and unable to make even simple decisions. This is not stupidity, it is a specific neurological state. Psychology. The inner psychological experience of freeze is one of the most disorienting and difficult to describe of all the F-response states. The most common report is of paralysis of will. The mind can see what needs to happen, can hear itself instructing the body to move, and remains entirely unable to make the body comply. This gap between knowing and being able to act is deeply confusing and, for many people, becomes a source of profound shame after the fact. Why didn't I just leave? Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I push them away? These questions, asked in hindsight from outside the freeze state, are asked by a person who has returned to prefrontal function and cannot comprehend the state in which they were operating during the event. The person in freeze was not making a choice. They were in a neurological state in which choice was unavailable. The relationship between freeze and dissociation is central to understanding its psychology. The slightly outside of oneself quality that many people report during freeze, the experience of watching what is happening from a distance, of feeling separated from one's own body, of moving through events without fully inhabiting them, is dissociation in its early form. Dissociation is a protective psychological mechanism that allows the person to be physically present in an intolerable situation while psychologically creating distance from the full horror of it. In mild freeze, this dissociation is minimal, a slightly unreal quality, a sense of things moving in slow motion. In deep freeze, it can produce the full experience of depersonalization, the sense of being a stranger to one's own self. Freeze and shame have a particularly painful relationship. Because the freeze response looks like passivity and inaction, and because our cultural narratives valorize active response to threat, the person who froze during a threatening experience frequently emerges from it with profound shame about their own response. This shame is not only painful, it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened. The person did not choose not to act. Their nervous system selected the only remaining option available to it, given the information it had. Behavior. From the outside, the freeze response can be remarkably difficult to identify precisely because its most obvious feature is the absence of visible action. The person in freeze may appear calm, which is why it is often missed or misinterpreted as indifference. They may sit or stand very still. Their face may show a fixed, slightly blank expression. Their gaze may have a specific quality of looking without quite seeing. They may be completely unable to speak, or may speak in a flattened, distant voice. Movement, when it occurs, may be slowed, tentative, or robotically mechanical. Subtle social freeze is extremely common and extremely unrecognized. The person who says absolutely nothing in a meeting where they are being criticized, not because they have nothing to say but because they cannot access words, is in social freeze. The person who cannot respond to a distressing text message for hours, who sees it and simply cannot formulate a reply, is in communication freeze. The student who sits in front of an examination paper and cannot write a single word despite knowing the material is in cognitive freeze. These presentations do not look dramatic. They do not look like a deer in headlights. But the underlying neurological mechanism is the same. In interpersonal conflict, freeze produces what can look like stonewalling. The other person simply stops communicating, stops engaging, appears to have shut down or tuned out. The partner observing this behavior may interpret it as punishment, withdrawal, or contempt. It is, in fact, often freeze. The nervous system has assessed the conflict as a threat of sufficient magnitude to trigger immobility, and the person is genuinely not capable of engaging in the way they are being asked to engage. Spiritual and inner experience. Freeze carries an uncanny inner quality that is difficult to describe from outside the experience. Those who have been in deep freeze, during an accident, an assault, a medical emergency, a severe shock, often describe it in terms that reach for the extraordinary. Time seems to stop or slow dramatically. The self seems to recede to a great distance. The world has a crystalline, hyper-real clarity about specific details while becoming unreal in its totality. There is sometimes a profound quiet, a silence beneath the event that is unlike anything else in ordinary experience. Some contemplative traditions have noted that the state of freeze, paradoxically, touches something real in the territory of ultimate experience. The forced cessation of the ordinary thinking mind, the withdrawal of the self from its habitual engagement with the world, the meeting of absolute limitation, these are also, in very different contexts and for very different reasons, the territory of deep meditation. It is important to distinguish clearly between these two phenomena. The freeze state is involuntary, driven by terror, and occurs in the absence of safety. Contemplative stillness is voluntary, cultivated over time, and occurs in the context of deep safety and practice. They may share some superficial neurological resemblances, but their meaning, their mechanism, and their consequences are profoundly different. To romanticize freeze as a spiritual state is to misunderstand both freeze and contemplative practice. But to note that the territory of absolute stillness has been approached from both directions, by the traumatized nervous system and by the seasoned contemplative, is simply honest. Mechanisms. The mechanisms of freeze are driven primarily by the tonic immobility circuit, a set of neural pathways that produce complete motor inhibition in response to inescapable threat. Tonic immobility, the scientific term for the biological equivalent of playing dead, is one of the most ancient defensive mechanisms in the vertebrate nervous system. It has been documented in every class of vertebrates, from fish to mammals. In humans, it is activated by the periaqueductal gray when the nervous system assesses that both fight and flight have failed or are unavailable and that the threat is close enough and powerful enough to make stillness the only remaining strategy. The key to understanding why freeze can persist long after the threat has passed is the concept of the safety signal. The nervous system does not simply return to baseline when the threat disappears. It requires a positive signal of safety, a sensory confirmation that the environment is now safe, to begin the recovery process. In situations where such a signal is not provided, or where the person is isolated and cannot access the social co-regulation that most effectively signals safety, the freeze state can persist for hours, days, or, in the case of trauma, for years, reactivated repeatedly by stimuli that the nervous system has associated with the original threat. The thaw process, The movement out of freeze typically involves a sequence of physical events that are important to recognize and allow. Trembling and shaking, which represent the body discharging the motor energy that was inhibited during freeze, often occur first. Deep, involuntary breathing, sighing, gasping, follows as the respiratory system re-engages. Emotional release, weeping, laughter, or both, often accompanies the thaw as the protective dissociation lifts and the full emotional experience of what just happened becomes accessible. All of these are completion processes, and all of them should be allowed and supported rather than suppressed or interrupted. Triggers. The external triggers for freeze include sudden overwhelming threat, situations in which there is no perceived exit and no perceived capacity to overpower the threat, situations that mirror past traumatic experiences even when the present circumstances are objectively safe, acute social threats such as sudden public humiliation or confrontation, and the experience of being completely overwhelmed. Too much stimulation, too much demand, too many things happening at once for the system to process. Adaptively. The nervous system's decision to freeze is essentially a calculation of available options. If fight is not viable and flight is not viable, freeze is what remains. Less obviously, freeze can be triggered by intense positive states as well as by threat. Extreme excitement, overwhelming joy, profound awe, any state in which the nervous system is pushed beyond its current regulatory capacity, can trigger elements of the freeze response. This is why people sometimes seem to go blank, to lose words, or to become suddenly still at moments of great happiness or shock that is positive rather than threatening. The nervous system does not distinguish perfectly between overwhelming good and overwhelming bad. It distinguishes between what is within its regulatory capacity and what is not. Variations. The freeze response exists along a spectrum, from the most acute and dramatic to the most subtle and everyday. The acute sympathetic freeze, the deer-in-headlights moment, is the most recognizable, sudden, complete, involuntary immobility in the face of immediate threat. This can occur in a car accident, during a physical assault, in the moment of receiving devastating news, or in any situation of sudden overwhelming danger. Social freeze is one of the most common everyday expressions. The person who goes completely blank when put on the spot, who cannot find words during a public challenge, who sits silent in a room full of voices and cannot locate their own. Cognitive freeze, the specific inability to think, plan, or access information under pressure, is what produces exam paralysis, the blank page of the writer who cannot begin, the presenter who knows their material completely and cannot access a word of it once they stand before an audience. Relational freeze is the shutdown that occurs during or after interpersonal conflict. The person who cannot respond, cannot engage, cannot explain, and seems to the other person to have simply gone away. Trauma-bound freeze is the chronic or recurring freeze state that is triggered in the present by stimuli associated with past overwhelming experiences. This is a freeze that lives inside PTSD, that makes a person go suddenly rigid and absent in the middle of an ordinary conversation, that their system has learned to activate in response to a tone of voice, a smell, a type of light, or a specific time of year. Misinterpretations. The misinterpretation of freeze carries some of the most serious and consequential consequences of any misread F response. The most devastating of these is the misreading of tonic immobility during sexual assault as passive consent. The scientific literature is unequivocal on this point. Tonic immobility during sexual assault is common, occurring in a significant proportion of assault survivors, and it represents an automatic neurological survival response that has nothing to do with consent or agreement. The person who could not move, could not speak, could not push the other person away, was not making a choice. They were in a neurological state that precluded choice. The cultural and legal misapplication of this misunderstanding has caused incalculable harm to survivors who already carry the added burden of having to explain why they did not resist in the way that observers expected them to. In everyday social contexts, freeze is regularly misread as rudeness, indifference, or incompetence. The person who says nothing during a heated meeting may be assumed to have no opinion or no backbone. The person who stares blankly at a question may be assumed to lack intelligence. The student who cannot write the exam may be assumed to have not studied. The colleague who does not respond to an angry email for 2 days may be assumed to be avoiding accountability. In each case, the reality may be freeze, a genuine neurological inability to respond in the moment or immediately after the moment that is entirely involuntary. Attributing moral meaning to a physiological event is one of the most common and most harmful things we do to one another. Long-term effects. When freeze responses are unresolved, when the body does not get to complete the thought process, when the survival energy remains locked in the system, the long-term consequences are significant. The most common and widely recognized is the encoding of the freeze state within trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder frequently involves the repeated reactivation of freeze responses in the present, triggered by stimuli that the nervous system has associated with the original traumatic event. This reactivation can be subtle, a sudden blankness, a difficulty finding words, a brief dissociative moment, or dramatic, a full shutdown in response to what appears to others to be a minor provocation. Chronic or recurrent freeze produces a pattern of progressive dissociation that can eventually become a persistent feature of the person's experience. Depersonalization, the feeling of being a stranger to one's own self, of observing one's life from behind glass, is a long-term consequence of repeated freeze states that are not resolved. Difficulty accessing emotions, difficulty making decisions, the persistent sense of being stuck in life, difficulty initiating action, all of these can reflect the chronic activation of inhibitory circuits that were originally designed for the emergency of freeze and have, through repeated activation, become a background feature of the person's way of being. Physically, chronic freeze contributes to patterns of body holding, areas of persistent tension, numbness, or disconnection that may be carried for years and that can manifest as chronic pain, restricted breathing, or digestive dysfunction. Real-world examples. The person who is fully qualified for a role but goes completely blank in interviews, who knows everything they want to say and cannot access a single word of it the moment the interviewer asks the first question, is experiencing cognitive and social freeze triggered by the evaluative pressure of the situation. The abuse survivor who lay completely still during an attack and has spent years convinced that this stillness was evidence of complicity or weakness is carrying a catastrophic misunderstanding of their own perfectly appropriate neurological response. The child who goes silent and blank during parental arguments, who appears not to be affected, who continues to stare at the television as if nothing is happening, is in social and relational freeze, processing nothing because the system has gone offline. The experienced professional who loses all capacity for language when ambushed in a meeting by an unexpected aggressive challenge from a colleague or superior is in social freeze. The person who cannot open their mail, cannot return phone calls, cannot make decisions, and cannot begin to address mounting practical concerns during a period of severe life stress is in a mild chronic freeze in which the sheer overwhelm of the situation has exceeded the nervous system's processing capacity. All of these people are doing what their nervous systems were built to do. None of them are choosing their response, and all of them deserve to understand why. How to work with the response. Working with freeze requires a different approach than working with fight or flight because the energy of freeze is inhibited rather than mobilized. The most important principle in working with freeze is gentleness and slowness. Attempting to push someone out of freeze too quickly, to demand that they speak, act, respond, or engage before the system has naturally begun to move, risks triggering either a return to deeper freeze or an overwhelming release of the held energy that the system is not ready to manage. Somatic titration, the practice of making very small, slow physical movements to begin the thaw process, is one of the most effective approaches. Wiggling toes, softly moving fingers, slowly rolling the shoulders, gently rocking, these micro-movements begin to signal to the nervous system that movement is safe and possible without overwhelming the system with the full discharge it is not yet ready to complete. Physical warmth is a powerful activator of the social engagement system and a gentle counter to the inhibitory state of freeze. A warm blanket, warm hands, warm water can all begin to signal safety at a bodily level before the mind has access to that information. Orienting exercises, the slow, deliberate act of looking around the room, noticing specific objects, identifying what is present in the current environment, are particularly valuable because they help the sensory system register the difference between the past threatening situation and the present safe one. Orienting is what animals do immediately after a threat has passed. They pause, they look around, they confirm that the danger is gone. Teaching a person to orient deliberately gives the nervous system the safety confirmation it needs to begin its recovery. The presence of a safe, regulated relational figure, someone who is calm, warm, and not demanding, is one of the most powerful tools for helping a frozen nervous system begin to move again. How to shift toward function. The shift from freeze toward function is one of the most delicate of the transitions described in this book, because it involves asking the nervous system to relinquish a state of inhibition that it selected precisely because all other options seemed unavailable. The polyvagal ladder concept, the idea of moving up through nervous system states one step at a time, from the shutdown end of the spectrum toward the regulated, socially engaged end, is particularly useful here. Moving from freeze toward function does not happen in a single step. It happens in a series of small, manageable steps, each of which requires the nervous system to tolerate a slightly higher level of activation than it was holding in the freeze state. Pendulation, a technique from somatic experiencing, the body-based trauma therapy developed by Peter Levine, is one of the most effective tools for this transition. Pendulation involves gently moving awareness back and forth between the sensation of freeze, the locked, still, braced quality, and a resource, something in the body or environment that feels pleasant, safe, or neutral. This oscillation gradually builds the nervous system's capacity to tolerate the activation that the freeze was holding back, allowing it to be released in small, manageable amounts rather than all at once. Over time, with sustained somatic work, the person begins to experience what Levine describes as the completion of the interrupted survival response. The body is finally allowed to do what it could not do during the original threat, and in doing so, it releases the held energy and with it, much of the held trauma. Integration notes. Freeze, when understood and integrated, offers something genuinely valuable: the wisdom of not acting. The capacity to pause before responding, to wait without knowing, to sit with profound uncertainty without being driven into premature action. These are gifts that the freeze experience, metabolized and resolved, can leave behind. In a culture that values rapid response, confident action, and constant forward movement, the capacity that freeze cultivated, for stillness, for watchfulness, for waiting, is often undervalued. It should not be. Some of the wisest responses to threatening situations are ones in which nothing is done, in which the person sits in the not knowing long enough for the right action to become clear. Integration of freeze means developing enough safety and resource that the system no longer needs to lock down in order to survive, and in that security, the stillness that was once involuntary becomes available as a choice.